So I'm out here in the middle of the day trying to find birds, and it's not been too easy because it's very hot and the birds are taking shelter. You might ask, why am I out here during this time? Well, it's because I like the heat a lot. Now it's only 28 degrees, so that's not a very 28 degrees Celsius, and that's not a very hot temperature for me. But it's the hottest I'm going to get today, so I'm out here to enjoy the temperature. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about gear in photography. And I think a lot of people have talked about gear, so I want to say something a little different. And I've been reading a book. Actually, it's a good time to make this video because I've been reading a book. And the book is about technology. And it's written by one of the pioneers, or at least one of the great voices in the philosophy of technology, Jacques Ellul. He wrote several books. This one is called The Technological Bluff. I highly recommend it. I think it's actually even better than his first book, which I haven't finished. And I haven't finished this book either. But going back to photography and gear, I think I should make a video about this because I do talk a little bit about gear on this channel and I do promote it a little bit. And I like to talk about gear because I think when you're creating art, you do need a little bit of gear. And I think, and we all know this, that gear is really so heavily promoted in photography so that most discussions, most interactions on the internet have become about gear rather than photography. And yes, there are always people out there enjoying photography rather than gear, and the internet might magnify that, but I think it's a more serious problem. Now, I'm not going to just go out and say that and say what everyone else has said, is that, you know, advertisers and companies want us to buy gear, so they make us think that the gear is kind of useful, necessary, necessary for photography, because that's been known for a long time. Actually, Ellul mentions an interesting example in his book. He mentions at the time in France, I think it was around 1950, when the government and power companies started constructing more power stations, but people didn't want to use these power stations. So what they did was they encouraged people to use it using a variety of techniques. They pushed people to use electricity, basically, even though people weren't really that interested in using so much electricity. Of course, people wanted to use some electricity at the time, but they weren't interested in using more electricity. So the government introduced certain incentives for this program, like making electricity cheaper if you used more of it. So in reducing the rate after a certain usage, which is kind of interesting. And the whole point is that at the time, there wasn't a strong tendency to adopt new gear, to go after new gadgets, as he calls it. And I think we see a lot of that in photography today, right? I mean, yes, new gear can give us some new capability, but theoretically, the camera, for example, I'm out here shooting macro photography, and let me see if I can get my camera for you. But see this camera, this is my macro camera. It's the Panasonic G9. This camera is quite old. I think it's around 7 years old now. I certainly bought it a long time ago. I think it was around 2020 that I bought it. And it was already a little old by then. It wasn't a new camera because it even came with the latest firmware that it has now. It's going to be hard to get this camera. Hold on. Sorry about that. So basically what I was saying is that even old gear right now can serve the vast majority of photographic purposes. Technology, there's pretty much a law of technological development. It's kind of well known, but people don't like to admit it. And the law is that technology in any field, in any domain, always reaches a point of diminishing returns, past which the energy expenditure and the time expenditure and the expenditure of effort into that developing more technology in that area isn't worth the benefits. And the benefits go down very quickly. So you see that with all sorts of technologies. Like cameras pretty much right now are like that. I recently read about, there's a new camera coming out today. It's some Hasselblad camera that has HDR from start to finish. But then you have to ask yourself, for example, just for that camera, let's just talk about that camera, for instance. HDR is HDR really kind of useful enough or interesting enough to really make it worthwhile to switch over to all kinds of new displays that have it, take pictures that have it, edit pictures with HDR in mind, etc. And really, I personally think the answer is no. I think photography, the image quality of photography is already quite good. Yes, you can get very nice looking lifelike dynamic range or more lifelike dynamic range with HDR displays, but again, I think that we've come to the law of diminishing returns here. Is that really something that we should be going after? And Alul kind of made the point here that back in the day, human beings in general, I guess, didn't really go after technology. They didn't have the tendency to adopt new gadgets, new devices that are incremental improvements over old ones as fast as they do now. And if you could define a numerical coefficient, he didn't say this in mathematical terms, but I like to put it in mathematical terms. If you could define a mathematical coefficient, a number that describes the tendency, the strength of our tendency to go after new technology, then that number would be increasing over time. And that's interesting. And we all know, of course, that advertising has played a role in that. But another thing that we have to kind of keep in mind, well, we have to also apply the law of emergent phenomena to this issue. The law of emergent phenomenon basically states that with a sufficient level of complexity in some dimension, when the sufficient level of complexity is reached, then a new type of phenomenon comes about that can't be easily understood in terms of the atomic phenomenon that make up the stuff that causes things to happen, whatever that is. So let's not get too philosophical here. All right, so what is the emergent phenomenon here? And I think Alul was kind of hinting to the fact that new emergent phenomena was breaking loose in the 50s and the 60s. And now, in 2025, which is 75 years later, what do we have now? Well, I think it's kind of obvious. This initial stage, the atomic phenomena of advertisers trying to get us to buy things, has been going on for a long time. But because of high-speed communication and because of all of that stimuli happening over a long period of time, what we get is a new emergent phenomenon where we ourselves are creating a society and a kind of expectation of acquiring new gear. It's no longer just the advertisers that are doing it. It's us. It's the consumers themselves that are powering the advertising scheme. You can see that because the most effective way to get someone to buy something, one of the most effective ways is word of mouth. But word of mouth is kind of one of those things that isn't so efficient when you don't have instantaneous high-speed communications. High-speed communications, along with high-speed transportation, those are the things that kind of allow these new phenomena to come about based on old human behaviors. Once that phenomenon has been activated, once it comes about, then we have to also expect another thing. We have to expect that human thought processes will be modified. As we know, people tend to think of themselves and of human beings as rational creatures, where we make discrete decisions, but that's not really what happens. Like, we have a continuous stream of thoughts that go through our mind, whether we decide to think those things or not. I mean, everyone has random thoughts that pop into their mind, daydreams, and who knows what else. What happens then is that stream itself is modified by individual and collective behavior. Collective behavior influences individual behavior, and all of the stimuli that results as a result of that behavior becomes a modification, a tool that modifies that stream, and henceforth modifies ourselves, modifies our entire being. What has happened there is that we have shifted from entities that tend to go after expression, human expression, into entities that go after production, mechanical, technological production. Production is now our default, not just behavior, but our default instinct. That's what I'm trying to get at. Our instincts themselves have been modified to go after production. And we see this in photography again with things like AI noise reduction. I mean, in my opinion, AI noise reduction and machine learning noise reduction is absolutely ridiculous, overblown, overrated. There doesn't seem to be a lot of real improvement in the photography out there, how people express themselves. But what has improved is the efficiency of photographic production. And I think that's what AI noise reduction really does, because if you think about it, the vast majority of people out there with a camera, yes, they might still enjoy photography. Yes, they might still like the artistic side of photography. And yes, they might still produce very good photography. And we see that because lots of good photography is being produced today. But underlying all that, I was going to say that underlying all of that, even though we can still do photography in this day and age, underlying all that is an almost cultured instinct, a cultured instinct for production, for pure production to power algorithms. We are more likely to go after what is likely to be popular in the algorithm. We're more likely to seek styles of photography that are more compatible with algorithms. And we are more likely to operate even in a way that is compatible with algorithms. Operate in the sense of going out, shooting and processing photos and uploading them immediately before thinking about them for a certain period of time. Subtle behaviors, even though we can make rational choices, subtle behavioral tendencies have been modified from this entire emergent system that we ourselves have created on top of all that basic advertising stuff. So what I want to say about that is that the only way out personally to escape this closing in of the claws of technology is to distance yourself from this informational input. And so to that end, I think the only thing you can do is take commitments to spend certain amounts of time completely away from the internet, completely away from telecommunications technologies. And I don't mean just taking an afternoon off. I mean really taking days away from the internet, as many days as you can. I'm writing an article about this, but a day is a real commitment. Taking an entire day away from a telecommunications technology is a real commitment. That is the most effective way to create distance. And personally, I've also found myself, I take 2 days off the internet per week. Once in a while across the year, there might be some exceptions, but basically my rule is to take 2 days off the internet per week. And by doing that, I already find that I care so much less about what happens on the internet. It helps me focus more on photography, and I think this needs to become a kind of worldwide phenomenon. It needs to become a worldwide phenomenon where people disconnect more and more from the internet and realize that these diminishing returns, because the returns are diminishing with regard to technologies, we are going to see a push, an even harder push in new subtle ways to get people to buy more gear, because the more useless new gear becomes, in a way, the more we're going to be pushed through new means to buy it, because that's the only way that technology can sustain itself, at least for now. Eventually, at some point, technology will become self-sustaining, and it won't even need us to buy stuff anymore, and that will sort of be the end of consumerism in a way, at least in the form that we know it. I'll have to make a different video about that because that's a very complex topic too. So in short, first realize that gear is not extremely important, especially getting a lot of new gear is not extremely important. It's not important at all, pretty much, to create very nice photos. That's one. Number two, even if you do realize that, there are going to be subtle behavioral modifications just by being exposed to all of this stuff, to not just advertising, but to the actual social environment that we have today, where everybody obsesses about new gear because we are social creatures and we mimic. And three, the only way to sort of overload this process is to take time away, significant contiguous periods of time away from the internet. So I hope you enjoyed this diversion into gear and photography. Of course, that doesn't mean you have to give up your camera, but it does mean that there's going to be a balance somewhere and that you can definitely take lots of good photos without acquiring too much new gear. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again next time.